Hello, my name is Greg J. Smith. I'm a Canadian writer and cultural worker with Holo. And today I'm joined by Canadian artist Mitchell f.chan, who I'll introduce shortly. This is the third episode of the 2024 edition of Alt History, an online speaker series we began last year. And in it, we turn to folks on the bleeding edge of art and technology to help us understand lost and forgotten moments in digital culture. And if you've been tuning in for a while, you're probably pretty familiar with the agenda. But for those of you that haven't seen one of these sessions before, when I say alt history, I'm kind of referring to this idea that new technologies and cultural developments are often synonymous with erasure, right? Something new replaces something old. So we forget how or why we used to do things, what words or communities meant. So addressing moments, practices, and labor that have faded from memory or been outright forgotten over the last 3 decades, our goal with these sessions is to not simply wax nostalgic about the past, but critically engage this erasure or forgetting and use it to make sense of the present. This series is brought to you by Generation, a Braga, Portugal-based space for creation, performance, and exhibition within the domain of contemporary music and the relationship between art and technology. And my team at Holo. We are an editorial and curatorial platform founded in 2012, focused on what we call emerging trajectories in art, science, technology, and culture. And these interests manifest themselves in a few ways. In periodicals, we've published 3 beefy digital art anthologies over the last decade. Online at our website, holo.mg, we kind of have a timeline of exhibitions and tech and culture news, which is being updated kind of daily. And then finally, through collaborations with cultural partners, like you're watching right now. So thanks to Generation again for the invitation and opportunity to do this series over the last 2 years. It's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed the conversations selfishly, but I also think we've had some really kind of interesting windows into different little facets of digital culture. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Mitchell f.chan today. He's going to be talking about the significance of video game manuals in gaming and how these benign and now essentially obsolete documents are a springboard into bigger conversations about narrative and art and world building. So Mitchell is an artist who has been described by one critic, I love this, as committed to the most serious ideas of conceptualism in the most playful way possible. His most recent works include The Boys of Summer, and we're going to be talking about his works, I'm sure, today, an interactive sports management simulation, and Winslow Homer's Croquet Challenge, an allegorical croquet video game about Reconstruction-era America, commissioned by the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. His pioneering blockchain artwork, Digital Zones of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibility, is currently exhibited at the Fondation Prada, I butchered that pronunciation, sorry, during the Venice Biennale. I kind of I ruined the most important final note, Mitchell. I'm sorry. So I'm going to shut up now and let you begin your presentation.
Hey, Greg, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And here we go. I'm gonna bring up my screen. Okay, thank you, Greg. It's wonderful to be here, even though I have to say that your prompt to recall something technological that is now obsolete has made me feel very old. You asked me to do this, and I thought, well, I mean, surely I can't remember things that the kids today wouldn't remember. It turns out, no, there's so many things from my childhood that don't exist anymore. Um, but despite this, I've soldiered on, despite the depressing reminder of my own mortality. And I am here to recall one of my fondest childhood memories. And it would go something like this. All right, it was every weekend would begin with Friday afternoon, right? My parents, or more likely my grandparents, would drive me to the video store. And we probably could have done an episode on video stores, could have done an episode on Blockbuster, maybe would have felt a little bit predictable. We'd drive to the video store and I'd rent a video game. I'd rent a Nintendo game or a Super Nintendo game. And after selecting the video game, getting from the store, I'd be in the backseat of the car, buckled up, driving back home. And one of my fondest memories is reading the instruction manual in the back seat of the car, right? And this was a really exciting thing to do. It was this moment of anticipation before playing the game, and it was really preparing me for the experience of playing the video game. And sadly, this thing from my childhood does not exist for gamers today. And I think, pretty soon we'll talk about why that is. There are really obvious and logical reasons why this doesn't exist. But first, I want to talk a little bit about what these instruction manuals did, right? What was their function? So here we go. This is like when you bought Legend of Zelda, or when you rented it from the video store, like you got all this, right? The physical cartridge, and then you got the instruction manual. There was, with Zelda, I remember this really well. There was that little booklet at the bottom was like the secrets. That was literally like the walkthrough for the most difficult areas of the game, and you got this physical map. So what did the instruction manual do? Before we get to any of that, and this is like an interesting sidebar that we don't have to spend too much time on, but remember that instruction manuals were also, especially for PC games, a form of digital rights management. This is King's Quest 4, which will bring some people all the way back. And you would get to a point of the game, and they would ask you to verify that you own the game by opening up the instruction manual. And it says here, in the section tips for new adventure players, what is the fourth word in the second paragraph of tip number 2? And you have to enter that word or else you would be locked out of the game. Like, simply having the instruction manual was proof that you had that you had paid money for the game. And of course, people would photocopy the manuals, or they would make guides like the one on the right of this slide here, where they would just say, these are the answers to all the questions. But it was a form of DRM for PC games. But for console games like Zelda, all right, what are we getting here in this package? All right, well, we're getting a lot of didactics, obviously instructions on how to play the game. That's what the instruction manual does, right? X button, is your sword, and B button is jump, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happened to that? Well, now obviously a lot of that's been offloaded to in-game tutorials and things like that, right? And online walkthroughs. You would get, the top secret pamphlet. That's been offloaded to the internet, and maps now also exist inside the game. And we can talk about all that stuff, all right? And it's interesting, but it's a little bit obvious why that stuff doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of people could make the argument that it's better to keep it inside the game experience. I'll disagree for reasons that we'll get to. But the thing that I loved the most about the instruction manuals were the illustrations. You would get these like bestiaries, and they were illustrations of the creatures that you were going to encounter in the world and what your character looked like. And so I'm cheating a little bit here. This is the original Legend of Zelda for NES. You see that blue character in the middle of the screen. That's just sort of a blob, has something sort of vaguely sword-like in its hand. If you were reading the instruction manual, right, you would know that it looked like this character here at the bottom of the instruction manual, right? That it's this centaur, and look, he's got like ripped abs, and that sword is, actually pretty fearsome. He's got a shield, and I think you can't even really see that in the pixel version. And it's actually really funny here in the Zelda instruction manual. They do show what it looks like in the game. It looks like they didn't even bother taking really good photographs of it. This is clearly like photographs of a CRT screen that just shows this blurry blob of pixels. But this was really cool, and it prepares you for the experience. And implicit in this is this understanding that everything you're going to see visually on the screen when you play this game is an abstraction, right? Like, no, obviously this isn't a centaur, right? A centaur looks a lot more like this illustration, but we understand you're playing a video game with technological limitations. You are going to see an abstracted version of this. And that, it seems kind of obvious, right? Like, of course, you're playing on these primitive systems, these primitive graphic systems, but whoa, that's actually a really important understanding between the viewer and the designers of these experience. And it's not to be taken lightly, the idea that you're only engaging with an abstraction. This continues right here. This is the Super Nintendo Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and you see that blurry blob of pixels over there on the left, and that's actually the ball and chain soldier over there, on the right, and he looks sort of more fierce, and he has this cool pose, and already the player's imagination is at work filling in the details of what is going to be presented in these really low resolution abstractions, right? So in McLuhan terms, This makes the video game a much cooler medium. We're filling in all of these details, right? And this continues like even as games become more technologically sophisticated, as game consoles become more capable of representation. Over here, we have a page from the 64-bit installment in the Zelda franchise, right? Ocarina of Time. This shows all of the things that video game instruction manuals bring to the experience, right? Outside of like diegetic explainers, we have a map. So we're establishing some context for the world that you're going to enter. You have a little bit of lore about the characters. They're telling you some details, some information about them that is not going to appear in the coded text of the game. And we're getting the illustrations so that our visual imaginations start working, right? And even on and it's a good thing that they do, because even on these more advanced consoles, right? Like here's Ganon as he is in the instruction manual, and here's how he is in the low poly version of the game, which is, you know, on its own looks a little bit silly. I'm not really afraid of that guy, but thankfully the instruction manual has built him up a little bit to be somewhat less clownish looking, a little bit more diabolical. So abstraction is the real thing that I want to talk about when it comes to instruction manuals, how they are an artifact that suggests like it promises aesthetic abstraction in the experience that you are going to have. Now, I don't want to pretend that this is something that is not, right? I'm not pretending that all of the video game designers or video game artists working in this period of the 80s and 90s were, you know, intentionally trying to like adopt like De Stijl aesthetics or studying cubism or like, you know, this is my take on early Christian spatial representation or anything like that. No, I know I'm not trying to do that to you. I understand there were technological limitations, and these were really clever and, you know, now seemingly stylish solutions for working within those technological constraints. And yet they're decisions that are being employed. I don't even want to say that like people aren't like pixel art abstraction anymore. It's that people aren't even favoring an abstract approach these days, right? So it's like these are the top selling video games of 2023. All right, there's Hogwarts Legacy, Madden 24, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, all the top selling games of 2023, and like all photorealistic, which to me leads to a very boring visual landscape. I find that most video games today are they bore me. Like their aesthetic style seems to be assessed only on one axis, which is like, you know, how much does this look like the real thing, which is such a shame, right? I mean, there's such a lack of imagination. Um, there are a few notable exceptions, right? Such as like the fourth best-selling game of 2023 was the latest Zelda franchise, which remains one of the only game franchises where the promotional art you see over here on the right is allowed to be different from the in-game art on the left, right? So once again, we understand that we're dealing just with sort of abstract, you know, representations. And granted, this kind of cell-shaded, cartoonish look is not quite as abstract as what we were getting in the world of extreme technological constraints, you know, that characterized like the 1980s and 1990s and the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. But just putting these pictures side by side tells me that there still is that understanding of aesthetics, that the in-game aesthetics are not the platonic version of the thing, which is still allowed to exist in the viewer's imagination, right? And so abstraction, like that's basically, you know, what I'm interested in talking about here, right? And then I think that this points to something else, right? Okay, so we're losing abstraction. when we lose video game instruction manuals. And why is that? That is because for abstraction to exist, there has to be a space between the artistic artifact in front of us and what it is that we want the viewer to think about, right? There has to be some kind of space between that, right? Between the image and its referent. And that space doesn't exist, right? In the time that I'm talking about, right, in the 80s and 90s, in the times when you would read the instruction manual on the car trip home from the video store, there's literally a space. There's my screen here, and I have the instruction manual and illustrations maybe open 18 inches away from me on the couch. And that 18 inches is enough to start to create that dialogue between my imagination of the imagery and what the imagery represents, right? This is possible. So abstraction is, I don't want to say abstraction is happening because of instruction manuals. No, instruction manuals are an indicator. They are a tool used to like enhance the things that abstraction can do in terms of igniting the imagination. But why don't instruction manuals exist anymore? Okay, this is an obvious question. They don't exist because there are no like boxes. We don't sell video game experiences as packaged goods, right? That is really obvious. And so there's this interesting phenomenon to look at. The real phenomenon that we're looking at is how, when we change the commodity form of something, it entails the changing of the experience of the thing as well, right? And this is where this conversation starts to come back. And I didn't mean for this to happen. I was ready to just kind of wax nostalgic about video game instruction manuals and how cool these illustrations were. And before I realized, oh, this actually comes back to, you know, a theme that I'm constantly exploring in my art, which is that the package that you sell affects, you know, the experience of what is inside. There is no changing the commodity form of something without changing fundamentally how someone views it, how their mind will be activated whenever you present it. So I'm going to leave a little bit of meat on the bone here, but maybe this is a point where I would like to open it up. What we're really talking about is a shift in how we sell digital experiences, leading to a shift in how we are permitted to interpret those visual experiences. Because yes, graphics are more representational today because technology is more sophisticated and we have graphics cards and so we can make things look more photorealistic, and so people naturally want to do that. But I think a little bit of it is also because it's harder to make an abstraction because there isn't a space where you can put another image in the viewer's mind that your experienced abstraction is bouncing off of. And that has to do with how we sell the experience.
Okay, that's rich. I had a bunch of questions and I might throw half of them out because I have a bunch of new ones. And
Great.
your most recent line of thought makes me think about, you know, maybe the contemporary version of this is we don't have the manual and we don't have that open space to explore narratives. But what we do have is like, you know, I play the Last of Us video game, and then the thing I get to augment it is like a high production value, air quotes, prestige TV expansion on the
Right.
narrative. That, and I you know, just see that I just read some middling reviews for the Borderlands 3, what is essentially the Borderlands 3 video game movie this weekend. There's been this like collapse of video games into you know, the IP Hollywood machine, where, you know, that in the 80s, you know, Nintendo was obviously a very big company, but there was not quite an equivalent of that Super Mario Brothers movie notwithstanding. So this is interesting.
Yeah, well, I think that's I mean, I think that's actually a totally different like issue, right?
Yeah.
About, you know, how we're monetizing IPs and the demand for every one of these experiences to be an IP that is expanded upon in another commercial product, right? But not like, it's so fun, like when the way that these IPs want to think about the interconnectedness of different media is that they'll all sort of strengthen brand recognition, right? To sell
Yep.
more tickets or move more units of each thing. And, you know, the video game instruction manual, and again, like this talk isn't entirely about video game instruction manuals. It's using the instruction manuals as one sample artifact of this bigger
Yeah.
phenomenon of here are multiple media and they're sold as one thing. Like they're in the same package, like with the expectation that not even on a conscious level of seeking out, now you're going to seek out the movie, now you're going to seek out the
Yeah.
video game, now you're going to seek out the breakfast cereal, that your brain will fill in the gaps between them, which creates a cooler media experience, which opens up the possibilities for aesthetics, right? And that sort of thing.
Okay. I'm going to ask two questions to trace back to this will be the nostalgic portion.
Yeah.
So you shared the Zelda example and you talked about these rides home. So just to not date yourself, but just maybe share a little bit on some of the games or manuals you specifically remember. I saw the King's Quest and I was very happy to see that. I was a Sierra player. So I'm just kind of
Mm-hmm.
curious, when you were doing this, obviously some of these were echoing in your mind and presumably Zelda was a big one, but what else kind of stuck in there?
Sure. Here's one of my like favorite examples of
Yeah.
the ways that like I would say like technologically enforced abstraction would sort of ignite my imagination as a
Yeah.
kid. When I was a kid, one of my favorite activities was me and my best friend. We would spend all afternoon drawing our own Mega Man characters, right? If most people are probably familiar with the Mega Man franchise. It still exists today, but when it originated on Nintendo, right? These were Nintendo. Remember, Nintendo had a screen resolution of
Yeah.
256 by 240 pixels, right? And one character was not taking up the whole screen. One character was taking up like 10% of the screen. So they had these low poly characters. And I went back to look at this, obviously, when I was
Yeah.
researching it. And just, look, those artists did a great job. They did a great job working inside these like 24 by 30 pixel squares. Like a lot of these characters, they had personality, but of course they weren't very detailed. And me and my friend, we would spend an entire afternoon with like reams of printer paper drawing our own Mega Man characters. And they would
Yeah.
have all these little gadgets hanging off them, all these details that could never ever be represented on Nintendo in those 256 by 240 pixels. But that was great. Anything that was characters, obviously, the it seems like the artists, they were great cartoonists. They would manage to get a lot of personality into them, but there were limits in terms of what they could do. And usually, like, they wouldn't be trying to represent such outlandish designs. The platonic version of these characters that would be illustrated in the instruction manual would remain pretty simple, but they all had some, illustrative detail that wasn't possible, right? That would let you imagine the materiality or details of the character. Pokemon would be a great example, right?
Yeah.
Pokemon debuts on a black and white Game Boy and is just a bunch of characters. And they kept the characters pretty simple. But the illustrations in the instruction manual had a certain, had a different flavor of charm to them, I would say.
Okay, great. Those are exciting ones. I don't know much about Pokemon, but I didn't know that its origins was it actually like video game first or video game what came first out of the
Oh, you
card
know
game?
what? I don't know if the video game came before
Yeah,
the cards, to be
yeah,
honest.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably yeah, probably cards. Okay. And so another question, and this is just obviously this seems like we're going to talk about your practice, I'm sure, but like so all of this set, well, actually yeah, I'm going to go forward with this. How have you thought about because you obviously have thought about this so deeply and you've made you've the croquet game and then the sports simulator, the stats simulator kind of like
Mhm.
how did you bring this kind of thinking and maybe reverence for the didactics of instructions to your own works?
Well, so
Yeah, yeah.
this is really so the idea of putting all the didactics
Mhm.
inside the game, right? So let's talk about this for a little bit. It's a really interesting phenomenon. You can have a lot of fun with conceptually, and actually, a lot of other video game designers have had fun with this idea that now there isn't an external instruction manual telling you what to do. It's all inside the experience, and so other video game designers have had a really good time with this. And the most notable one, like the one that I think almost everybody who's really into this field would mention, is Bioshock, right?
Mm.
So for people who don't know, Bioshock by director Ken Levine considered a sort of masterpiece of uh, it's considered like a masterpiece of video game storytelling that critiques the ways that video games lead the viewer to certain actions. So, of course, once you turn on the video game, once you get to the Bioshock era, which came out in, I think, like 2004, 2006, or something like that, when most of your tutorials and explanations are happening in games. So the game says press A to jump, you press A to jump. The game says move forward, past the door to the next level, you move forward through the door to the next level. And so the premise of Bioshock, spoilers ahead for Bioshock, is in the end, right, the sort of omniscient narrator who's telling you how to get to the next level, which enemies to defeat, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that was the bad guy all along, and it's a form of mind control that, he has been subjecting you to. So that's really, really interesting. And I think that one of the things that my work tries to play with a lot is the idea that once you seal off those boundaries of your world, of your experience, right, which the age of digital storefronts has done, right, now that you can never leave the couch, you buy the game from your couch, you get all the information you need to play the game on the couch. Once you have like an audience that captive, right, it there's a way that it eliminates criticality. Like there's a way that it turns people into zombies. And this is a strategy that is being used all over the place, right? Like it seems like every sort of social media platform, but also like service platforms like Uber, they're all using the techniques of video games in order to keep customers in their gameplay loop, right? And that could be Uber and like Uber Eats showing you a progress bar,
Yep.
right, loyalty reward programs. Everyone's coffee shop has loyalty reward programs where you rack up points and you get a high score. I don't know, you get a free coffee or something, right? It's essentially how it works. But obviously keeping everyone inside the platform, that's become a universal strategy for anybody who's doing business online. It's another example of gamification entering all any business is doing capitalism is
Yep.
using a host of video game techniques, including that completely all diegetic instructions.
Hmm. I mean, just to hit it again, like so when you communicated to players in your art games, because they're not,
Mhm.
well, I don't want to split hairs about what is an art and what is a video game, because that's just a perilous, pointless path. But how did you tackle this yourself? You used BioShock as an
Sure.
example. Yeah.
So I don't quite have the resources and
Of
maybe not
course.
even the smarts to tackle it on the level that like Ken Levine would do it on
Yeah.
Bioshock. But it's a thing like this, right? I always try to be aware of what I'm telling the player to do and what I'm telling them not to do, and
Hmm.
letting them reveal themselves through that decision. So, in the two video games that I've put out in the last couple of years, right? The first one was Winslow Homer's Croquet Challenge, and the player is just prompted to win a croquet game. And most players do that, right? There's no benefit to doing anything besides winning the croquet game. But if they, take a break and do the things that are not, that are not explicitly like instructed, they look around and they see, a portrait of an economic system from that era, right? There are prison laborers who are working in the background. And actually, most of the art and most of the editorializing of that artwork happens outside of the the field of play,
Yeah.
right? I'm always very aware, like croquet has rules, this video game has rules. So to be an artist, all right, and to be critical of the idea of like a play field where rules prescribe a certain behavior, I put the things that are really interesting to me outside of the rule set, right?
Hmm.
And it's the same thing with Boys of Summer is a very like it's a pretty simple video game in a lot of ways. You try to make the number go up, right? It's inspired by baseball. Baseball is just a whole bunch of people who do ridiculous things to try to make their number go up. They like lift weights and they practice hitting a ball, and all they're trying to do is get the batting average up, home runs up, whatever. And in the game, right, it illustrates how that mentality then leaks into other facets of our life. So after you're done making your batting average go up, like, you try to make your number of Twitter followers go up. You try to make your net worth go up. You try to make your sort of like attractiveness to other people on dating apps go up, right? And that's the only instruction. And there's sort of narrative things that happen, but because they're not like scored, all right, then they're not explicit instructions for the viewer or
Okay. So
player.
yeah, it sounds like a lot of the design is not the rule set in the video game is, there's vehicle to do this, and there happens to be a game at the center of it. Okay, here's a
Exactly.
yeah, go ahead. If you can riff on that, otherwise I got a meaty one.
No, I was just going to say, like,
Yeah.
it makes me realize that, like, ultimately the fundamental organizing principle of most video games today, right, is a diegetic rule set, right? Is
Yeah.
diegetic instructions, actually, right? It's go point A to point B, whether like point A is 0 and point B is the highest number, whether
Yeah.
point A is the beginning point of the map and point B is the exit point of the map, right? But that's the fundamental organizing principle of most video games, which has now become the fundamental organizing principle of like most, again, like businesses that want to use the internet to take your money.
Okay. To the art world.
Yeah.
Another obvious link to me here when we talked a few weeks ago about this topic, and it's been kind of percolating in the back of my head. And one obvious connection I see to works, the works you haven't talked about today. The video game instruction is kind of a contract, and you have made works that involve contracts, and there's another layer of meta there in that those contracts are homages to important kind of conceptual art contracts. So just for some background context, for the reader or listener who might not be that familiar with the work, your Immaterial Zones project kind of picked up on what Yves Klein was doing with Immaterial Zones, which is essentially selling like volumes of gallery space. And there was like a little ritual associated with that. And then you've also done work inspired by kind of the master of conceptualism, Sol LeWitt, and I think of his sentences, conceptual art. And his very famous artwork contracts that you can Google and see the instructions for one of his works to be installed. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit of this overlap between instructions in art and instructions in gaming.
Yeah. So this was a thing, and I was not expecting this topic to
Yeah,
go to this place until I
yeah,
was like, drilling down on it more after our initial conversation. And I realized it's extremely relevant. Or, maybe it's just my own myopia and tunnel
yeah.
vision that makes it seem like relevant. But it's funny what I found. Okay, so we talked about the instruction manual. To me, it represents a space between the experience of the thing and how we're going to interpret it, right? And how that space does not exist anymore. And that space was really enabled as a product of the space between the commodity bundle and the experience itself, right? uh it's really weird. Like I said, well, why don't we have instruction manuals anymore? Well, because we don't sell video games in boxes anymore at a store, right? You just directly download them. And it is weird that mental space, all right, and that space for abstraction happened because of the commodity bundle. Right, you buy a box that has a cartridge in it and a book. The cartridge is not the experience. You're not going home to just look at that cartridge. You're going to put it in your NES, etc., right? And so this is a really weird inversion of what has happened in art. And this is what I was really interested in when I was doing the piece you discussed, digital zones. And what I was really interested in the world that, sort of came out of that exploration, which was like the world of NFTs. And one of the theses that I had, like, was it like 7 years ago, right, was that the conceptual art project, right, which I think originates in 1958 with Yves Klein's Zones of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibility and continues with like the conceptualists, particularly in the 60s, is the delamination of an artwork as a commodity from the artwork as experience. That's what all these people figured out, right? Is that art, let us take a priori that art is a thing that needs to be commodified, it needs to be sold. That's how patronage works, that's how art gets made. So then you got to have something to sell. And what the conceptualists figured out is, oh my gosh, I can sell an idea, I can sell a volume of invisible air, all right? I can like I can sell performance as long as I just got to make this piece of paper and say that that is like link. It's a separate thing, but I sell that. The experience is different from the commodity, and things are going to work out, right? Um, and what I was really interested in 2017 was that now like the same thing was happening in digital economies everywhere, like not just with cryptocurrencies, although certainly in cryptocurrencies, right? Like what the Bitcoiners have figured out is that they can sell a vibe, all right, if there's a digital ledger of it, right? As long as there's a digital accounting of it. So you separate the accounting of the thing is not the thing that gives it the value, right? What gives it Bitcoin value is vibes. And, you know, we can just record your ownership, your share of those vibes. But it's also happening sort of in, in all digital economies. I even used, when I was writing that piece 7 years ago, I used the example of horse armor in Skyrim, right? The idea that like, okay, there was this like experience of just being able to imagine that your horse has armor now, and then people will buy it, and that's okay. And what I'd hypothesized 7 years ago was that now that art was figuring this out through blockchain and tokenization, oh, art would be able to get even weirder, right? Because now we have these digital tokens. They're even better than paper certificates in the sense that like they're more attractive commercial products, because they can go up and down in price faster and easier. And so therefore, oh, amazing. Art doesn't have to like look like, a landscape painting or anything like that. Would get more wacky, zany art. And here's what's interesting. That didn't happen. All right. We completely delaminated the ownership of an artwork from the artwork, and art got, let me tell you something. You look at some of that NFT art from the last couple of years, I got some bad news for you. Art did not get better. Okay. It did not get better. It got much worse because all of the attention and actually a lot of the non-diegetic excitement and lore around the artwork just went and attach itself onto those certificates. It didn't attach itself onto the art. People get really excited and come up with mythologies about the price of things, but not the substance of the artwork. So it actually didn't work out at all like I thought. Now let's look at video games, all right, where we had this situation opposite of art. The bundle, the thing you bought, was different from the experience. Again, you don't go home and look at the cartridge, but you do buy the cartridge, and then you go home and you have this experience. And it was great. It was actually great for, as I was saying at the beginning of this talk, activating a person's imagination, establishing the aesthetics of the video game experience as a form of abstraction. And now, all right, the opposite has happened. We stuck them together. Now, the thing that you buy is the thing that you experience, all right, is the bundle of data, streams straight to your PlayStation. You get it right away. So there can't be any space between the thing that you buy and the thing you experience. And again, I don't want to overstate this. I'm not saying that graphics are photorealistic exclusively because they're, sold to you digitally instead of in boxes. But it does help. And regardless of, and even though I think that was only a small reason why games look the way that they do, and it's only a small reason why people interact with games the way that they do, which is, I think, like less critically, like less coolly, again in the McLuhan sense of the word, but it plays a small part in it. And so it's funny. It's the opposite phenomenon as what's happened with art and digital art in particular. But going in both directions actually has been bad. Well, maybe that just makes me a grumpy old person.
No. I mean, there's drift in all mediums. I mean, one thing, this isn't exactly related, but it relates a little bit to like you're kind of talking. You talked about there being what NFT art was, say 2017, and you have these early experimenters, and then a wider crop of people coming in and getting democratized for better and worse, and the vibes changing and the aesthetics changing. I think about film a lot, like how film, we kind of live in this like Marvel Pixar sequel universe now, and like the 90s and not to like good old days the shit, but like there was like a real renaissance in independent filmmaking until the early 2000s, and then something happened, and it's not like movies are still 90 or 120 minutes. But like the rules of what what can succeed in the market are so different now. And I know we can have breakout hits, and we do all the time in the streaming era, but like movie for movie, and there's something that has fundamentally changed about mass market entertainment, say post streaming platform or something. And I mean, I think about the way you're talking about these like, you know, like Steam or Epic Games platforms or something like that. And
Mhm.
I feel like there's quite a lot of similarity there. You know what I mean? Like it's like the constraints get tighter as the platform gets more totalizing or something like that. There's no question
Well, but
there.
you know what? The Marvel Cinematic Universe is a
Yeah.
really interesting counterpoint to this because
Yeah.
actually every one of, well, let's just say like the last 20 of 32 Marvel
Yes.
movies, right? They actually do expect you to come in with all
Yeah.
of this non-diegetic knowledge,
Yeah.
right? It's all supposed to be garnered from other movies in the universe, like to the point where I tried to put on like, a Spider-Man, the Marvel Spider-Man movie with my kids, and
Yeah.
they're like, we have no idea what's going on. Like, who is that guy, and like, why does Spider-Man like him? And I was like, well, that's Tony Stark, and he's Iron Man. And he likes him because in like Avengers, like Civil War, he brought him into the team, but and then he was with Doctor Strange, and like, right. So I guess it's, I mean, that just goes to prove that like it's not strictly a good thing to like allow all of this like meta like narrative and lore and world building into your artwork.
Yeah, that's rich. Okay, I want to hone in on another thing a little bit. Like, you talked about photorealism is kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
and there is like a little bit of a lament there. I feel like
Yeah,
it's not so interesting to you. Like, do you it's not as simple as like it's boring, but like I'm just kind of curious, do you see any people so like I'm sure you're interested in lots of when we were talking earlier, you name checked Kentucky Route Zero as like an exciting
yeah.
indie game. And there's lots of games that work outside this like photorealistic, you know, I want to see the hair sway in the breeze world. Like, so I'm just kind of curious, do you see any people working in video game art or even just games, just really kind of doing something interesting, either kind of tangentially aside from photorealism or maybe completely outside it?
I see, very little, to be
Yeah.
honest. And uh, it's like it almost is as simple as like I find video game aesthetics. Most video games have very boring aesthetics these days because it tends to fall into one or two categories. One
Yeah.
is just the asymptotic route towards photorealism, where we end up getting kind of stuck in the uncanny valley, and like
Yeah.
we're kind of getting out of it now, but
Yeah.
um, but that's okay. Or we see a lot of nostalgic skeuomorphism, and so actually, like obviously, particularly like among indie video game developers who don't have the budgets to pursue photorealistic graphics, they will tend to go the other way towards like things that look like pixel art, things that look like video games of the past.
Yeah.
And they're often doing it to invoke a certain amount of nostalgia, which I'm okay with because a lot of times that nostalgia is built out of a genuine admiration of those art styles, and
Yeah.
maybe it's not their fault that it's received as nostalgia. So for example, a game is a Zelda like game, like Hyperlight Drifter is a beautiful pixel art experience. Um, and but you do see, like, it's very rare when you see games that just develop a style that is, first of all, a product of the technological constraints that they are working in, and that is a real confidence in their own voice, like their own vision as artists. So yeah, I had mentioned like Kentucky Route Zero to me is, it's one of the most beautiful aesthetic experiences that you'll encounter, where things are pretty like low poly, low detail, because the team was three people,
Mhm.
but they are expertly composed. And one of the reasons, actually, I think why that game is so beautiful is those developers were really inspired by theater design and theater production, right? Where
Mhm.
you have limited budgets, you can't just build a whole bunch of things on the stage at once, which is very analogous to how an indie game developer has to
Yep.
think about budgeting their time, right? And their resources. And other smaller games like um, uh, Sayonara Wild Hearts. just beautiful sense of color palette, beautiful character design, not trying to do too much, but everything they do is going to be a deliberate decision about aesthetics. So you do see it. And when I see a game that looks like that, I mean, I just get so excited to be in a new aesthetic space.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems that it's rare that we get an opportunity to be in one because so many people are
Mm-hmm.
working from templates. I mean, sure, artist games are always going to be artist design, but it seems like at least like say this is a gamer, strategy games look a certain way. First person shooters look a certain way. Pixel, I don't know, roguelites or something look a certain way. So I guess it's a bit of an audacious step to go against convention. Okay, another question about the art world. And
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of like my contract question. So if we look closely at museums in the culture sphere, they too are full of instructions. In an
Mm-hmm.
exhibition, we have the didactic placards beside the works, which some people read and many people ignore. I
Right.
do walk over and read them personally. And the
Mm-hmm.
curator's essay helps us encounter the work properly or understand what isn't evident or visible. And then outside the white cube, we have this like chatter and babble from critics and tastemakers framing conversations, although it seems to be in shorter and shorter supply these days. Could you comment a little bit on what the more rarefied art world could stand to learn from didacticism in video games?
Oh God. So that's a great point, and I hadn't thought about that. But you're
Yeah.
right. We see the two approaches, right? The audio
Yeah.
tour, you get the headphones.
Yes, I did mention
That's
that. Great
right.
one.
That's the
Yeah.
BioShock
Yeah.
in-game tutorials. Okay, so press X to
Yeah.
appreciate Mondrian. Okay, now turn left. Okay. And versus the curatorial text. And I
Yeah.
don't know what kind of person you are. I'll tell you, I'm always a curatorial text person. When I
Yeah.
go into a gallery, I try to get the essay,
Mhm.
and then I'm very deliberate about when I read the essay because I love to not read it right away. I
Yep.
like to read it afterwards and then cross-reference what I thought I saw with
Same.
what I was like supposed to see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I love that, and that's exactly the experience that we're talking about is just allowing a little bit of space between what I'm experiencing and what it's supposed to be. I do like that. And so, what do I think art institutions could learn about that? Well, okay, as we just said, they have both strategies employed. We both seem to like the instruction manual strategy as opposed to the in-game tutorial strategy. Um, and I think that so so I guess a good point is that like I began this by being like nostalgic for like the really beautiful instruction manuals
Mhm.
that clearly were the product of like a lot of care and a lot of thinking and understanding that the text had to supplement the experience. So I guess it's just a wish for better and more beautiful didactics. I have a big issue with I think a lot of museum didactics being I'm not going to be like the first or last person to say this kind of cliched thing, but I don't, I really dislike the academic
Yeah, of
language
course. Yeah.
that comes with a lot of art texts. And I honestly wish they were, written a little bit more in the sort of like, in the tone of things that
Yeah. What
were more
international art
accessible.
English? Like not that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like
That's
maybe
great.
maybe instruction manual language is a thing that they should adopt. Not entirely. It doesn't have to be quite like press X to appreciate Mondrian, but maybe
Yeah.
a little bit in that direction. One step
Yeah.
wouldn't hurt.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Um, okay, one more thought. And I think we're kind of this is perfect because we're kind of on time here. When we were planning this session, you said something that has been echoing in my head, and you said we're starting to see games as exhibitions. And I've been thinking
Yeah,
about that ever since. So we're at this point where art audiences are kind of finally, I've been waiting for this. It feels like 20 years to me, but it feels like big venues, bigger organizations are finally accepting video game aesthetics. And you could go to a regional museum and see, not a national museum, but a regional museum and see like, an artwork made with a game engine. And that wouldn't be a weird
yeah,
thing.
no,
There seems to be breaking out from like a niche, nerdy, theoretical space to like a more mainstream idea. So could you, I mean, but I'm just curious, like, could you elaborate on the idea of You said like you said to see games as exhibition. You could just elaborate on this idea of exhibition in game space a little bit though. Because like, okay, you're
Yeah.
seeing video game aesthetics in museums, but what if the exhibition is like a game? And that's how I heard what you said. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thank you. Actually, you've helped me figure out the right answer to the
Okay.
previous question. And
Okay.
we're actually going to be, no, and we're actually so far off where we
Yeah.
started. Like, let's
Okay.
move from being in praise of the external video game instruction manual,
Yep.
and let's start talking about assessing the benefits of the in-game tutorial, right?
Okay.
Earlier, we talked about how really the structure of every video game is right, like following like diegetic instruction manual, right?
Yeah.
And but there's a number of different ways that you can do that, right? Like the in-game map in an open game world, right, is notoriously it's a map with it's not quite as open as
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
seems, but there are a number of different quest markers, and you can go to any of them, right? Or you can have the game that's on rails, right? You can have the whole tutorial level, where it's like now you will not be able to pass unless you learn how to press the jump button, and now you won't be able to pass until you learn how to press the double jump button, et cetera, right? So you're right. You said now you can go into even a regional museum, you can see an artwork that's made in a game engine. All right, they're figuring that out. They're figuring out that the video game engines are a legitimate way of making art. The video game aesthetics are actually a really important visual
Hmm.
language in our culture. I walked into one of the best examples I saw in the past couple of years. The Metropolitan Museum in New York. Their grand entrance, commission was a piece by Jacoby Satterwhite, all created in game engines. It was really
Yeah.
beautiful. It adopted the language of video games to tell, I think, a very personal story. Beautiful piece. But yes, what they haven't learned is that thing that we were just talking about, the ways that video games can, with their in-game tools, manipulate and direct people's experiences, the ways that they can subtly, all right, almost invisibly guide people's behavior, right? And that is a thing that you should be able to make an exhibition of, because an art exhibition is really about putting a whole bunch of artifacts out there and offering people the ability to take this guided path in a way that will make it all one cogent experience, right? One cohesive experience. And so it was like I remember I got really turned on to this, that museums needed to figure out video games around the time of the pandemic, when everybody was like, remember around the time of the pandemic, a lot of museums, their idea as a solution was to create these online viewing
Yes.
rooms where you basically like you walked around like it was Wolfenstein 3D,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you saw some like maybe blurry JPEGs. I'm like, no, like that's not it. The innovation of video games isn't that you can make a representation of 3D space, right? It's that you can make skill trees, you can make point systems, that you can do all of these different things. And there are a few pieces of software that have just come out in the last couple of years that I think are providing exciting examples that museums can and should latch onto. So one example is, and it's great that software developers, game developers, are employing these techniques to celebrate cultural artifacts that are important to them. Right? Nobody's trying to make. Well, there was someone who tried to make like Thoreau, the video game, I think, to like limited success, but
Yeah.
there's a game called The Making of Karateka.
Right.
Karateka was a video game from the 1980s that was really innovative. It was like one of the first games to use rotoscoping. It had these, like, for the time, just incredible, mind-blowing animations. And so somebody, wanted to make a tribute to that. They made a piece of software. It's a video game. You can download it on a Nintendo Switch. It's called The Making of Karateka. You can play. It's a wonderful example of digital art preservation, in that you can play game like the version of this game as it was adapted for like Amiga, was adapted to Commodore, as was adapted to whatever, all these different platforms. And there's like a number of like documentary interviews with the developers, people involved, and you progress like with the progress bar and like experience points, right, through this exhibition of talking, sort of very lovingly about the game. That's great. And so things like that are just these, amazing ways to do all the things that museums and curators are supposed to do for artworks, right? Expanding out our understanding of them, um, building these narratives around them in a way that, comes straight to people's homes. Like I bought this game for $30 and, I got a sort of very like museum style experience. It's great.
Right. And none of the pretension, of course, like
No,
no, for better and worse, like just totally its own thing and using this
yeah, for
other
better and
medium.
worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Super cool. I love that example. Okay, briefly,
Mhm.
are you working in a game right now?
Yeah, I'm
Could
working
you
on
could you
a
tease it a little
suite
bit
of
as our
games.
closing
Oh boy, yeah. I'm working on a suite of games
yeah,
that are like essentially I'm trying to just employ all of the different techniques that video games use to suggest that you win, right? Because everything
yeah.
like ultimately a score counter in the top right hand corner of your screen, that's an instruction, right? That's a
Hmm.
diegetic instruction. It tells you there's a score. Tells you you better make that number go up, right?
Yes.
And so it's a way of suggesting a behavior to a person, right? When you put, like ultimately, you create when you put a road on a map, right? People just understand this is the logic of the real world, but it's also especially the logic of video games. There's going to be something at the end of that road. You make a tower, there's an expectation, there's going to be a treasure at the top of the tower. So I'm making like a suite of video games where I try to, employ sort of game logic suggestions of how a player ought to behave in order to win, but create unwinnable games. And in this way, it
Yeah.
it suggests like it points instead of pointing to the prize, it points to the logic that made you expect the prize. And I believe that this is important because those are the same tools that they're using over on Twitter and over on
Yeah.
Instagram and over on Uber, right? Like I
Yeah.
say, anything that uses computers to make money has learned this language, and they're using it if not against you, then let's just say like against your checkbook.
Yeah. Or at least your attention span.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, Mitchell, thank you so much for being so generous and thinking on your feet today. This was a pretty
Oh,
rangy
thanks, Craig. This
conversation.
is
Uh, a lot of fun, man.
yeah, I'm super excited at how far we were able to take it.
Okay. Well, tune in about a month for the next edition of Alt History. We're going to be joined by Maurice Jones, the former, I don't know if it's still active or not, but director of New Tech Japan, and he's going to be talking about uh, techno as a genre and how it's evolved and changed, and maybe was one thing a few decades ago and is another now. So, thank you for your attention today.